Someone once said that seasons change, but people don't. And, that always seemed wrong to me, and after finishing this book, that kind of comes to mind again. Anyways, I decided I should actually talk about some of the academic books I read, besides just in my weekly updates, and dedicate some videos to them because they're worthwhile. Now, I've done maybe one or two in shorts before, but an actual video seems like a proper attention. Now, I feel like I should have put my suit coat on, but here I am. I'm probably going to butcher this, but I basically wanted to come on here today and tell you why you should read a book. And that book, of course, is Winters in the World by Eleanor Parker. It has the subtitle A Journey Through the Anglo-Saxon Year. It has a blurb by The Guardian on here and a bunch of stuff on the back. The most important one on the back, of course, being the quote from the Wall Street Journal, which is top shippy. Of course, here it says, a heartwarmer for the coming winter. We could do worse than choose Miss Parker's book for a wintry companion. And actually, I started reading this basically around Advent, and I finished basically right at the end at after 12th night, after Epiphany, right when I finished. But I'm here to talk to you about it now. And this is essentially a look at the Anglo-Saxon calendar. Now, for the Anglo-Saxons, it has some uses that I don't like, that are racially, like religiously, like and sparked with like class. But in a lot of academic senses, this just means early medieval England, essentially, and the people who we would call the early English. Though, of course, England as a country would come later in this period, and that's why we kind of call them Anglo-Saxons. That's basically what they were called in Latin texts. They didn't seem to call themselves that. We normally divide them into Saxons, Angles, and Jutes. Of course, there might have been other groups in there like Frisians, probably some Franks, probably some Yachts, probably some Swedes and Danes and Norwegians and stuff like that, right? Just these Germanic peoples that came to Britain and they were not native to Britain, right? That's kind of the idea. Now, these people, they converted to Christianity pretty early on, and they spoke a language where the language I'm communicating in right now comes from, and we call it Old English. It's also sometimes called Anglo-Saxon. I see that term for it, not used as much these days. But Old English is something I like to study, okay? And I like to study this time period, early medieval England, or Anglo-Saxon studies, stuff like that. And this is fun because this is not a pure history. It's been described as lyrical, I saw online a couple times. But it really is a beautiful look at literature, essentially, and then the calendar, kind of how humans relate to this calendar in a religious sense, in a very natural sense as well. It's very, to use terms that we sometimes throw around when we talk about fantasy, is it's re-enchanting. It integrates you in a way back, right? So basically, let me just tell you a little bit about it, right? It starts with winter, hence the winter in the world. It actually starts with a preface, and it's a very good preface. You should read it. And it says, let's see, a famous preface from Anglo-Saxon literature introducing one of the books which formed part of Alfred the Great's program for rebuilding education among the English in the late 9th century compares the act of translation to going into the woods to collect timber, gathering materials for building, and coming back laden with branches. And basically, that is the author inviting us also to study this material for ourselves. The author does a great job of taking sources that you're likely never to read, or if you are, it's going to take you a hot minute to get to the understanding of it, the beauty of it in some ways. Well, you'll see the beauty right away, in my opinion. But we do get a lot of these excerpts from these sources, and sometimes we also get the original Old English. I don't think the original Latin shared, but a lot of these sources are written in Latin as well because there's a lot of church sources here. And of course, this in a lot of ways, this is very Christian in a lot of ways. It's a very Christian book because these are very Christian people. You can see hints, right, of this paganism. And a lot of these festivals probably have pagan origins, but a lot of it we also don't know because these pagans didn't really write much down. There's a good example near the end of the book in autumn. It's talking about the word bless, which basically means to consecrate with blood, but eventually got this, or when they converted Christianity, gets this association with the word, like a benediction type of thing, basically, which just means good speaking in Latin. And so it keeps this mentioning of blood or of blessing, but loses the connotation of blood added to that. So, but it's done expertly. Parker does such a good job. Um, there's an introduction after the preface. There's just a bunch of stuff. Honestly, it's really good. It's described. The seasons are described as winter is the coldest, spring is the frostiest, the rimiest, as it says here. Summer has the most sun, and harvest, of course, it brings good stuff. And so that's the thing. Also, we have winter and summer. Those are the ones that don't change as much, which is interesting. You have Lent is spring. The term now means something more specific, of course, which she goes into as well. And then harvest is what autumn is called. Autumn being a term, fall I think even being an even later term, though the word fall has been associated with the season for a long time. And we basically get into this idea of reckoning, the ideas of dates very early. We look over Bede's calendar essentially, right? Uh, Yola for December and January, Solmonath for February, Hrethmonath for March, Eirstermonath for April. Sounds like Easter month, right? And so forth. So we look at some alternate names for different months as well. And so we look at this. The reason summer and winter don't change much is because there's a two-season structure. And so what you think of as spring is part of summer, the book says, and the months we consider autumn fall partly at the end of summer, harvest partly in winter. And this probably explains why words for spring and autumn have fluctuated much more in history of English than the names of summer and winter. And so you'll see that as you go throughout, but you also get glimpses of history, like stuff that's happening, particularly later when we get to autumn. The author talks much more about something like the Norman Conquest. We kind of get later in history, which is very interesting. So we start with Bede's sparrow, which of course is flying through the mead hall. That is a very famous thing. That is winter, of course. And we talk about like winter building bridges, and that is of course ice, and it's described as a warrior. A lot of things are in Old English stuff. And then we get to midwinter, of course, which used to be the name for Christmas. It's the most popular name for Christmas in the Anglo-Saxon like corpus, essentially. And that was on December 25th. That's also the old day for the solstice, the winter solstice. It's no longer on that day, but Christmas still is for most of Western Christianity, at least. And so you'll see stuff like that, basically midwinter, and it's light. You'll have Modronite and Yule, and just how that all relates, basically. Candlemas, of course, New Year's Day, kind of the disagreement of where New Year's Day should be with these Anglo-Saxons, because they celebrate New Year's Day on January 1st. But in later medieval tradition, you actually get March 25th being New Year's Day, which is Annunciation, and is important in the Lord of the Rings even. So they switch back to January 1st eventually, and that brings us to spring as well. So in spring, you have, again, Lent. You have this conception on March 25th, which is 9 months later, December 25th. That's where you get the date for Christmas. You have Easter, which of course retains its German name, right? And no other like Germanic languages that really happen, as far as I'm aware. They generally have a name that is related to Passover, the word Passover. And because that connection to Passover has been obvious for a very long time to these Christians. And then you have, of course, summer. And at summer, we talk about blossoms and trees, and the pleasures of summer. And we looked at the word lithe, I think, and how it kind of describes a type of movement, maybe a type of person, like a dancer you could describe as lithe, but it kind of described weather. The sea could be lithe, conversation could be lithe, God would be lithe, right? Food, if it was sweet or something, could be lithe. I don't know why my image is insanely blurry, so I apologize for that. My camera is not having a good day, but my words should be good, hopefully, still. And so yeah, it's just a days of health, right? And then you'll see some poems still in relation to this, and even ones that aren't, like the Wife's Lament, for example, looks at summer, and it's not a very happy way of looking at it. But we also have White Sun or Whitsun. I'm not actually sure how people say that because I've never heard the word. Or Sunstead, which is midsummer, um, of course, which is the longest day of the year. Um, and then you get the harvest, right, the very end. And this is going to talk about a lot of stuff like Lammas, which is Hlafmas, basically, which is loaf mass. It's where the word Lord and Lady also come from, which means bread guardian and bread kneader, Hlaford and Hlafdia, lady or Lord and Lady, respectively. But harvest is this old term for it. And obviously it's important. And we talk about shield chafing as well in this relationship to harvest, right? Shaving means sheave's son. This is an important opening for Beowulf. For those who haven't read, we'll look at fallow meaning yellow, and sear meaning like dry and withered, which you get in the modern English word sear, sear, like you seared it, like a steak or whatever. And sere is really what we're looking at. And it basically only is retained as the author puts it here, shares in Macbeth, Shakespeare's Macbeth, says, I have lived long enough, my way of life is fallen into the sear, the yellow leaf. And that which should accompany old age, as honor, love, obedience, troops of friends, I must not look to have. And so they just have this interesting idea of aging, right? As all things age. And it's a very interesting, there's interesting looks at how, the Anglo-Saxons kind of survive when these Normans, and how it's this transition. In some ways, some things are retained and some things aren't retained, right? And so, like, well, I mean, okay, before I get there, it also mentioned like All Saints Day, not really Halloween or All Souls Day back then, but All Saints Day. And then we'll talk about the two conquests of 1015 or 1016, sorry, and 1066, of course. So this later period that's a little rough, but the Bede is honored by the Normans as well, it says, and other writers, because I won't bother you with this all, but the ending is very sweet. I feel like. Says the end, well, it was a tumultuous year, as full of surprise and upheavals, yet the yearly cycle is stable and unchanging. And so it continued for many centuries. All the festivals named in this entry for 1066 would still have been familiar 500 years later, when the architects of the English Reformation set about adapting or suppressing them, which this book did make me a little depressed as far as that went. But even after the Reformation, when many saints' days were stripped from the calendar, the high points of the festival year, from Christmas to Lady Day, Midsummer to Michaelmas, remain the same. It was really only over the course of the 20th century, with its dramatic social and cultural change, that the cycle the Anglo-Saxons knew became increasingly distant and unfamiliar, especially as more and more people lost touch with the rhythms of the agricultural year. Some ancient festivals, which were celebrated continuously for a millennium or more, pass almost unnoticed today. But in recent years, others, such as Candlemas and Lammas, have been experiencing a revival. And in secular modern Britain, it's not only for those drawn to their religious significance, but find meaning in those feasts. Such festivals offer opportunities to mark the passage of time, to gather in community with others, to acknowledge the profound value of our relationship with the natural world. In a time of ecological crisis, Anglo-Saxon poems, which recognize how fundamentally we are connected to the rhythms of nature, how dependent we are on the well-being of the earth, how grateful we should be for its gifts and its beauties, speak truths we still need to hear. And so while the Anglo-Saxon type of poetry didn't really survive, a lot of this stuff in the calendar did. Or if it didn't, it's more of a recent death that the author is really looking at. But I just thought this book was absolutely beautiful. It felt very romantic in a way. This connection humans of being in nature, right? I mean, in some ways you could say being in nature because it's God's plan, right? But even in a secular sense, I feel like it's deeply interesting. Provides very easy knowledge. The author presents it in a great way from many sources again. But it's also reintegrating, right? I mean, like I love Old English for the connection that I feel with it, right? Because in the words I speak every day in modern English. But this book informs me kind of a tradition and a liturgical calendar I'm not all that familiar with, right? And I'm kind of sad I missed out on that, right? And I think this latter maybe because I'm Christian, but maybe someone interested in heritage, or really you could even make it secular, right? Like this type of calendar stuff, community stuff, or any probably other forms of spirituality as well. But I mean, so like I love a history or something like, say, the one by Mark Morris, for example. believe that's the author. This was much more integrating, re-enchanting, right? It's romantic almost, and this putting this humans as part of nature and not at odds with nature. Um, and that's something I've always loved. That's something I always want, right? I want to. I mean, like humans are natural creatures, right? And I want to feel a part of that nature. Um, but it doesn't. It's not always easy. Sometimes I do feel at odds with it, especially in this postmodern world. But I think Winters in the World by Eleanor Parker could help you maybe um, feel a little more integrated with nature. So, wow, video comes back right at the end. Sorry about that. Tried to fix it. But anyways, Liam from Liam's Lyceum, maybe you'll check this book out if that sounds interesting at all to you. Hopefully I did it some justice. This went longer than I thought it would. But anyways, I will catch you next time.